Hi everyone, this is the second part of the Illustrator introduction tutorial, and in this portion of the tutorial we're going to talk about type. So you'll often be working with type in Illustrator, whether it's as a graphic element or putting labels on drawings or anything along those lines. And it's pretty straightforward to kind of create type. So the command for it is, or the shortcut for it is T, or you can click on the type tool icon here. Again, if you press and hold down on it, excuse me, I've got the hiccups, there are several other versions of the type tool. We're going to most often, I can't think of any time when in the recent history when I've used any of these other types of type tools, but for now we're just going to be using the type tool. And there are two ways to create type. One is to, once you've activated the type tool, click and drag to create a box in which your text will then go. So then if I start typing in here, I should have made a smaller box, it's going to return or wrap the line as soon as I hit the edge of that box. The other option is if I click on the type tool and click on the page without drawing a box, it's going to create type and it's just going to keep going until I stop or until I hit return. So it's not creating a box in which to create type or fill type, but it's creating a starting point, and then it's letting you control kind of where you hit return and those sorts of things. That doesn't mean that you can't manually control text in some of these other boxes, in the other type of box that you've made, but just know that there are two ways to create type boxes. I typically use this version. I don't know of any advantage or disadvantage. I think it's just more of a personal preference. The type itself is defined by a couple of different characteristics. You guys have all used word processing programs before, so you know about fonts and font size. These options are under the character panel over here on the right side. I'm going to move this to the top so that you can see it. It lets me choose the font family, so you know, every designer's best friend, Helvetica, which is now down here, and then it lets me choose the style, which is light or oblique, which means italicized, bold, straight, pretty self-explanatory, regular, oblique, which is just italics, or bold oblique. So these are the different styles of the font. So the font refers to the overall kind of umbrella of the font, and then the style lets you choose the more specific version of it. So I'm going to set this back to regular. Below that you have another series of options that are in this dialog box. You'll notice that some of these are also up here in the kind of command bar. You can choose them in either way, you know, in either location. If I switch to Helvetica here, or if I switch to Impact, you can see that it updates over here on the right side. I'm going to keep it with Helvetica. Below that is the font size. So if I want it to be bigger, I make the font size bigger. If I want it to be smaller, I make the font size smaller. The drop down gives you a series of defaults of kind of standard font sizes, but you can type in whatever you want. So if I want it to be 20 points, sorry, I changed this back to Helvetica regular, just so that we're looking at normal fonts here, or normal type here. And it's changing these things, you know, as we did before. If I have the type tool selected and no type selected, and I change this to, you know, 48 points, the next type that I make is going to be that size. If I want to change something that's already existing, I need to either have the box of it selected, or I need to have the specific text highlighted by double-clicking in the box to reactivate the cursor tool and then kind of selecting the part that I want to change. So in this case, I can change it to 24. I can change the style. I can change some of it to bold and some of it to regular. You know, you can start adjusting things as you would like for them to appear. So again, I'm going to select all of this, make it back to Helvetica regular. 24 point is fine for now. To the right of the kind of font size or character size is the leading, which is the spacing between the lines. When you see a number that's in parentheses, that's the default leading for that type of, or for that specific size of font. So Auto will turn that back on to whatever the default is. You can, though, go in and start adjusting the leading. So if I want it to be bigger spacing or smaller spacing between lines, I can adjust that here in the leading option. I'm going to turn it back to Auto. To the bottom of the size of the type is the kerning, which is the spacing between individual letters. So you cannot adjust all of the letters at the same time. Kerning is for specific kind of fine-tuning adjustments. So let's say that it looks like the space between this S and this semicolon is too big for my purposes. I can put my cursor in between those two, and in the kerning drop down, I can choose to bring them closer together, or I can choose to put them further apart. And the numbers just mean, you know, a lot more or a little more further together or further apart. So you don't typically do this for a block of text unless there's something very specific that you're trying to adjust. Usually kerning happens, or kind of fine-tuning through kerning happens when you're working with a, you know, like a logo or a title of something, when you've got a very big graphic element of type that you need to have very specifically kind of controlled in terms of the proportion, the geometry, and the spacing between things. Beside kerning is tracking. So tracking allows for you to adjust the spacing between the characters all at a time, right? So all of the type or all of the text will be further apart or closer together depending on the tracking. So if you want to fine-tune the adjustment between two letters, use kerning. If you want to fine-tune the adjustment between all the letters, choose tracking or adjust tracking. Below that, and I'm not going to show you what these do because I want you never ever ever to use them, are the vertical scale and the horizontal scale, which stretches the height or the width of type. Typography is a art. It is very carefully calculated and controlled, the kind of geometry of letters, their relationship to each other, and kind of what they look like at particular sizes and particular styles. You do not want to go in and make your type, you know, 200% of the height. It just looks terrible. It screws up all the geometric relationships. It's not a good thing to do. The same thing with the width. You don't want to change that. Below those are the baseline shift, and this basically allows for you to make subscript or superscript of something. So if I wanted to make a kind of a squared sign after, you know, if I wanted to type in, let's say, I want to type in CO2, and I want my 2 to be subscript, the first thing I want to do is make it smaller, and then the second thing I want to do is shift it down below the line. Or let's say, you know, I want to say x squared. I'm going to make my x bigger, and my squared, I'm going to shift the baseline of it up. So I can start controlling the location of characters relative to each other using that kind of where the bottom of the type is. So I'm going to set this back to 0, and I'm going to turn these to 24. Beside that is the character rotation. Again, this is something that you probably won't use ever, hopefully, but it allows for you to rotate one character at a time and, you know, turn something sideways within a block of type. So you wouldn't want to turn the whole line of type around, but if for some reason, I can't think of a good example of what that might be, you can turn one character around. You can also control the entire block of text, which is something that's more likely that you would do, but I'll show you that in a minute. Just to give you kind of a sentence that you can read. Below that, below these two, are a series of options for all caps, small caps, superscript or subscript as a default, underline, and strike through. So all caps will take something that's in sentence case or something where the first letter and proper nouns are capitalized and turn it into all caps. small caps will take the letters that were lowercase and turn them into a smaller version of the capitalized letters. And this, if you can kind of toggle these on and off. It's a option for creating all capital letters without turning on your caps key. To the right of that, again, you need to kind of have a letter to do this with. I can click something and make it a superscript or a subscript. This will take it to the default. You can then go in and adjust it as we were doing before with the size and the baseline shift if you would prefer. To the right of that is underline, pretty straightforward, so you can toggle it on or off. And to the right of that is strike through, so I can put a line through my text if I want. So those are the kind of basic character styles. If you aren't seeing all of those, I should have mentioned this before, if you aren't seeing all of those, you might have your options hidden. And so to be able to see all of your options for your characters are to the right here of where it says character in the top of the panel. You can hide or show options. So if you're only seeing the kind of first portion of the character options, if you're only seeing down to letting and kerning, click on this and show options and everything else will pop up. The last thing I forgot to mention is down here on the bottom, anti-aliasing is here on the bottom. And what anti-aliasing is that in on computer screens and in print, the pixel size is square. And so when you have something, right now we're seeing these diagonal lines as smooth diagonal lines, but they're really made up. If we were able to zoom in close enough, we would be able to see that it's the edge of that line is made up of a series of tiny little square pixels. Anti-aliasing is the process of adjusting how the computer controls the kind of visual smoothing out of those diagonals or curves or something like that. So you probably just want to leave it as the default, but if ever you're at the point where you're having issues with a diagonal or a curved line, you can go in here, and I say diagonal and curved lines as parts of elements of type. You can go in here and start adjusting some of the options for crisp or strong or something like that. Before we move on to the next tutorial, I want to cover paragraphs. So far we've been talking about the kind of letters and the elements and the font and blocks of text. We haven't really been talking about what happens to the text when it's when we're making a sorry, I can't type and talk at the same time. I'm just copying this text so that I have a block of text. When we have a block of text, how do we start controlling this as a group of objects? So that happens here under paragraph. I'm going to move this up here. Again, if you're not seeing paragraph, under window, go to type and paragraph. It should be here. And again, if you're not seeing all of the options, so if you're only seeing some options, you want to show them here. So paragraph, we've got a couple of different options here. The top row of icons are alignments. So if I toggle back and forth between these, you can see that I have left aligned, center aligned, right aligned, left justified, so all of the lines are stretched out to fill the box except for the bottom, which is aligned to the left. The same thing but with the bottom line centered, the same thing with the bottom line to the right, and then force justify, which makes everything kind of stretch all the way out. So you can control which version of alignments you're working with. Below that, you have options for indenting. So if I select a block of text and want to indent the first line 1/4 of an inch, I can do that. Sorry, it's 1/4. I just indented it 1/4 of a point. I want it to be 0.25 IN. We'll indent it 1/4 of a inch, which is 18 points. And I have to have the paragraph selected if I want it to be 0.25 IN. If I want it to be all of the type that's selected, or I can, sorry, let me switch this back to left justify. If I want to just have the first line indented, I need to go down here to the spacing before the paragraph and type in 0.25 inch. And that should have adjusted that. I'm sorry, it's the one directly below it. I went too far down. It's 0.25 inch. And that will adjust just the first line of the paragraph. The same is true over here on the right if I want to have a right indent for some reason, or if I want to make spacing before or after the paragraph, I can set that here. So if I want it to have 12 points at the end of each paragraph, it will then kind of put a 12-inch or 12-point space in between every time I hit enter. So if I were to go in here and hit enter, it's going to override my leading, which is the spacing between the lines, and make sure that there's a 12-point space between this line and this line. Below that you have the hyphenate option. So right now my paragraph, if I just click on the box, if I turn off hyphenate, or if I uncheck it, I don't have that many long words. Let me type in a longer word. If I type in Mississippi, so hyphenate is now on if it's checked. So Mississippi is now breaking and the part of the word is on the next line. It's not going to really do that. I don't have any other longer words. But if I turn off the hyphenate toggle here, it will force everything never to break and move from one line to the other. That's kind of a personal preference. That's a pretty strong one of mine. I don't like seeing hyphenated words. I think it makes it a little bit more difficult to read, especially if you're working with a really small block of text. If you're working with a kind of an image caption or a project description, you want to be really careful about the kind of visual reading of those. And so I would suggest turning hyphenate off or not allowing it to be checked as a preference. Again, that's a preference. It's not a requirement, but that's my personal preference. You can see that when we started putting returns into this paragraph of text or this block of text, that we have a little red plus sign that showed up in the bottom. That means there's more text than I can see in this block. And so I can grab the block and change how much text I can see within it. Or I can take what's left by clicking on this red plus sign. And you'll see that now my cursor has it looks like the top left-hand corner of a page with some type below it. And it will let me make a new text box and connect those two to each other. And you can see the kind of blue diagonal line that's showing you what's connecting to what. This is pretty great. It allows, and you can do this in InDesign as well, it allows for you to control kind of pieces of text at a time and have multiple paragraphs. So you could do something with columns, or you could do, depending on the layout of your page, you can kind of carry text over to the next block. If I delete this text box, it goes back to being a red plus sign here, and I can stretch it out and make it all fit. The next thing I want to show you is a really subtle thing, and I'm going to justify my text, and I'm going to put some punctuation in here on the end of one of these words, just so that you can see. Sorry, L-A-Z-Y period space. And I'm also going to allow for this type to hyphenate, so I'm going to turn hyphenate back on, and I'm going to just move this word. Obviously we're not working with actual sentences here, but I just want to be able to show you something with this hyphen and this period. Same works for commas, so I'm going to put a comma in here. Right now you can see that with this text justified and hyphenate on, when my kind of line of text runs into the edge of the box, it's putting the punctuation on the inside of it. Something that Illustrator allows you to do that not many other programs do is shift that punctuation to the outside of the text box, which is pretty nice depending on what you're trying to do. And the option for that is called Roman hanging punctuation. It means that the punctuation hangs out outside the box. So you can toggle that on and off to allow for it to shift in and out of the box. What that does, so I'm going to make a copy of this and move it down. It's a pretty subtle thing, but you know, as you start getting in and caring about subtleties in text, you can see that the difference here between what the edge of this box looks like and what the edge of this box looks like, even though they're both kind of justified, is very different, right? So this has a much cleaner, consistent edge because you're reading the edge of the type as the edge and not the punctuation. And then over here, so over here where the punctuation is inside that box, it starts to look like more of a ragged edge, even though everything is really lining up, because the weight of the punctuation is much less than the weight of the kind of type itself. So that's something that you can control in Illustrator and not many other programs. The next tutorial we're going to talk about curves and other ways of constructing lines and shapes.